Well, it's hard to know whether I can live up to that advanced billing, but I will try, and I will also try to make this as entertaining as possible. I prefer not to read from my book when I do these because there's plenty in there. In fact, I'm told that this was the longest manuscript ever given in at Random House at 1,500 pages, and it's been cut back to less than half of that. And while that sounds plenty daunting, and I apologize for that, people have told me that it reads like a thriller, and it's the fastest they've ever read a 667-page book. So you have that to look forward to if you haven't read it already. What I think I'd rather do than sort of read from that, which I don't like to do, is sort of tell you some stories from outside the book, stories that are mentioned in the book but are my sort of conclusions about what this book is really about. And that is, I think more than anything else, of course it is a history of Lazard, and it's especially the history of the incredible people who worked there. And I think one of the things that captured the imagination of people, I mean, because let's face it, it is after all an obscure French investment bank, is that it was so mysterious and so poorly understood, and until 1995 was a private company and had been for 155 years or so. And it was very hard to get to, and very hard to work at, and very hard to stay at. So somebody sort of pulling back the curtain on all of that for, I think, probably the first or second time. There was a book that was written in 1982, and a wonderful book called Financier by Kerry Reich, who was a reporter for Institutional Investor magazine. And he wrote, that was a book about Andre Mayer. And I decided, well, this had to be more than that. This had to be a book about the whole firm, its history, its people, and of course, when I started writing it, it was literally in the middle of what proved to be a conflagration between Bruce Wasserstein and Michel David-Weill, and I knew intuitively, having worked there, that there was no way the two of them could coexist in any peaceful way for any length of time. And so I knew it was just going to be a matter of time before the denouement arrived, and it did, right on schedule for me to write about it, along with the murder of Michel's son-in-law in a latex suit in Geneva, which I got to write about as well, and I'm happy to talk about that. It's really an incredible story of ego, of ambition, of aggression, and really these people who are frankly unelected to anything put themselves at the center of the nexus of three very interesting roads. The worlds of finance, the worlds of government, and the world of the media. And to reach the success that they have, each one of them, they basically had to master each of these worlds. And people like Felix, Michel, Steve Ratner, Bruce Wasserstein are master media manipulators. They are, masters of one aspect of finance, and they have incredible aspirations and ambition that we still live with. Probably it wasn't until last night that perhaps Steve Ratner gave up his quest in 2008 to be Secretary of the Treasury under Hillary Clinton, and he might yet figure out a way to do something similar with Barack Obama. He's extremely nimble, extremely ambitious, and sort of relentless in his pursuit of this dream, which of course was also Felix's dream, which he did not obtain, and that's what gives it a sort of wonderful Oedipal complex aspect to their relationship, which ultimately, as I describe in the book, blew up because it was an inevitable clash between them that resulted. But I think what I'd like to do is sort of give you some information about how I was able to pull this off, how I was able to get these guys to talk to me, and what they did and how they tried to control what I wrote about them, because every one of them in their way had forever, and I mean forever, been able to rise to the top of their profession by manipulating the press into their corner, and to have them become these incredibly important people in the eyes of the world, thanks to whatever media outlet they happen to be talking to. Now, what happened was when they confronted me, it was a very different story. Number one, I wasn't a beat reporter. I didn't have any need particularly, except, you know, common courtesy, to potentially talk to them ever again after I wrote this book. I had worked for them for 6 years, so you can imagine what it's like to have been what we called at Lazard a mushroom, which meant to be kept in the dark and shat upon for the years that I worked there, and then to confront these people with the fact that I was writing a book. So at first it was a little daunting for me, a little scary, and I didn't know whether or not they would cooperate. But the short story of the long story on that is that after Michelle agreed to speak with me, which happened very rapidly and early on, basically all the rest of them agreed very quickly, because they knew that if Michelle was going to speak, that they needed, and especially Felix and Steve Ratner and others, needed to be able to get their side of the story out in a way so as not to let Michelle dominate the storyline, which he was well capable of doing. So when I eventually did get to have these guys agree to talk to me, each one of them had a different strategy for how they were going to handle me, and I think I'll share that with you. And then we can answer questions about the Lazard book. I'm also working on a new book about Bear Stearns, so my head is filled with all of that, as you can imagine. You know, this Lazard book I finished writing 2 years ago now. So while it has been said that I know more about Lazard than any man, dead or alive, and that is true, I honestly believe that. That it is true. Steve Ratner said that. I also know a lot now about Bear Stearns, too. So Felix, the deal I had with Felix was that everything we would talk about would be on the record. And I'm sure you all know Felix. Again, the rule at Lazard was that only Felix could talk to the press, period. Anybody else who tried, it was like the third rail on the subway line. You were electrocuted immediately. Only Steve Ratner, who himself was a child of the media, having worked at the New York Times, having his best friend be Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher of the New York Times, felt that he had, and having been being a media banker, felt that he alone uniquely could try to rival Felix for media attention. Of course, that led to all sorts of trouble. So the deal I had with Felix was that I would tape our interviews. We must have had 6 or 7 two-hour interviews at places as varied as his apartment on Fifth Avenue to his Park Avenue office to one of my favorite places, which is where I saw him the last time, which was at the Four Seasons restaurant in New York, which I really wanted to go with him to, even though he ended up paying, or of course, as you know what happens there, you don't see a bill, so you don't know who's paying, but I knew it wasn't me. And I felt it was like seeing an animal in its natural habitat by going with Felix to lunch there. And I'll tell you a little story about that at the end. But the deal was that he could then review the transcripts of our conversations, and that if he, you know, didn't like what he had said, he could lobby me to change what he had said or to alter what he had said. And I didn't have to agree to it, but he could lobby me. And I thought that sounds reasonable enough. So at one point early on, Felix, who, as I'm sure you all know, had been, when he didn't become Treasury Secretary, he became ambassador to France in the second Clinton administration. And he did not like Jacques Chirac. I didn't know he didn't like him, but he made very clear to me early on he did not like him. Felix was very close to Mitterrand. He told me repeatedly, I mean, all these guys are completely enthralled by the French Foreign Legion and their little pins and what it all means in the hierarchy and which pin means what. And they constantly are very, Michel always wears the highest order on his lapel, and then Felix will kind of do that. And Felix was very clear with me that Mitterrand, you know, several weeks before he died, gave him the final order, you know, of the highest level in the French Foreign Legion pin. Now, Felix was, of course, not bothered at all by Mitterrand's anti-Semitic thinking or collaboration with the Nazis that was much discussed. Felix, of course, having been a Jewish refugee who escaped the Nazis and barely got out of, he had sort of a Jerzy Kosinski-like escape across Europe to get to this country in the mid-40s. Didn't seem bothered by that. Felix is a master of being able to keep contradictory thoughts in his head. I guess that's also the definition of being a genius, so he might qualify for that, but he's able to do all sorts of things on the one hand and all sorts of other things on the other that are completely contradictory, make no sense whatsoever, but he does them, as easily as breathing. So he calls me up one day, and Felix has a very high-pitched voice, and he says, I'll imitate this once, but you'll get the idea. He says, Bill, I just can't, this stuff about Chirac that I said, I just can't have it. I said, well, that's very interesting, Felix. Why not? He said, because there'll be an international incident if this is in your book. And he had said something like, Chirac is an idiot or something like that. And I'm thinking to myself, this is very interesting because the good news is this is not a book about Jacques Chirac. I mean, it's not even close to a book about Jacques Chirac. It's a book about you, Felix. So it's your lucky day. I'm not going to, we'll cut out the stuff about Jacques Chirac. So the 1,500 pages that I wrote, none of them included the Jacques Chirac line. And Felix, though, was really determined to win me, put me into his camp like he had every other reporter and like he had so effectively when he ran Mac in the city of New York during the bankruptcy era here. And he's the master of the one-line quip. He's absolutely brilliant with the press. I mean, he takes the time to explain the story and the very, very complicated and detailed versions of everything, and has plenty of time for all that. So he told me early on, he said he had an idea. He said, he wanted me to know, I think we were having lunch in his little nook that he had in his apartment overlooking Central Park. I mean, just beautiful. And his a maid came by who he called Pepita. And I always was quite taken with this whole series of events. It was like theater, really. I mean, it was like extraordinary theater. And he told me, he announced to me before this lunch that he'd already been asked. Now the book had, I don't think I'd written very much. I mean, and we were just in the early stages. He had been asked to already, he said, by 2 publications to review my book, and he just wanted me to know that, just right up front, I'm going to tell you that I've been asked to write the reviews of your book already by 2 places, and I'm thinking, this is not possible because this book is about him. So is he deranged? I mean, what is he talking about? No editor of a book review section in their right mind would ever allow somebody who the book is about to review it. So I sort of said, oh, that's nice, Felix. That's great. Okay, so now moving on to the discussion of the day. So he realized that didn't work. So then next time we spoke, he said to me, I have another idea, Bill. How about if I write the introduction to the book? And I said, Felix, well, I don't think that'll work either, but that's really a very nice offer. So it went like this, and it came down to a couple of things. Now, I was very, open with Felix. I mean, he knew exactly what I was asking about. When I was asking about, I asked him about affairs that he had, and I'm sorry if I bring this up, but this is the real world. I asked him about affairs that he had, and he got into an awful lot of trouble in the late 60s and early 70s when he advised ITT, one of his best clients, on the acquisition of the Hartford Insurance Company, and it led to a major scandal that many of you probably remember, and it basically almost ended Felix's career. He got hauled up in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the SEC investigated it, the Justice Department investigated, the SEC had any number of investigations. It was really, as I like to say in the book, the dry run for Watergate. Everything that was done to get out of this crisis of the Hartford ITT is exactly what was repeated by Nixon and Ehrlichman and Haldeman and Dean, etc., literally a year later in the Watergate break-in. So you can follow in my book what happened. Some people thought it was too long, but I thought it was really important to show in one place how Felix got out of this fix that he was in. And it was a big major fix. I mean, it's just a credit to his skills, because any other banker would have been fired instantly for anything remotely like this kind of negative publicity that Felix got into, but he got out of it. And one of the things that I was asking him about, which he thought for sure I would never find out, was that he was the target of a federal grand jury investigation in the Southern District of New York involving the parking of Hartford stock with Mediobanca, the Italian investment bank that Lazard had an investment in, and it was this, you know, really which is what this whole 8 years of investigation was all about. And it came down to this guy, Stanley Sporkin, who was an SEC investigator who later became a federal judge and now is a partner at Weil Gotshal in Washington, working for Bill Casey at the SEC, who was a friend of Felix's. I mean, you know, this is the kind of world that these guys operate under. But at one point, Stanley Sporkin said to Paul Curran, who was the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York in the late 70s, whose son eventually also worked at Lazard, just to show you how it all goes, that, you know, because at that time the SEC had no fining power, nothing like they have today. Some people say they don't do their job today, but they certainly didn't have the power then that they had today. So the Stanley Sporkin had to recommend to the U.S. attorney in the Southern District here to open an investigation into this. Felix appeared before the grand jury. He was not indicted. He squashed the investigation. He used all of his powers and his connections in Washington to do that. And he thought this was dead and buried, and here I am writing about it in this book and asking him about it. He was not very happy to be asked about it. So the other thing that really he didn't like is when I asked him about a very famous story that even I knew about when I worked at Lazard, and that was when Andre Meyer came looking for Felix one day, and Felix's office door was locked. And that was very unusual because usually the doors are open and unlocked. And, you know, Andre, if we wanted to see Felix, could see Felix in a second. Andre used to refer to Felix as his errand boy. So to have his door locked was unprecedented. Well, it turned out that Felix was in there with a woman. And Andre got very, very upset and was banging on the door until finally he said at the top of his lungs, "Felix, why don't you go to a hotel like the rest of my partners?" Which is not only funny, because it is very funny, but in fact, all of the Lazard partners did have hotel rooms where they did go to and carry on these kinds of assignations. And I know this because in the little directory of the firm in the early 70s, you know, it was very, very thin. There's only like 20 partners at that time. And they would list their home address, you know, 1085 Park or whatever, 1185 Park or whatever it was, you know, Darien, New Canaan, and also the hotels where they all had their rooms. And everyone had a hotel in a different room in a different hotel. So it was quite, and of course, Andre lived at the Carlisle Hotel. Right one floor either above or below John F. Kennedy and Jackie when they came to New York. And of course, Andre was the executor of the the trustee of the Kennedy fortune for a long time. They were very, very close. So Felix was not happy that I asked him about this incident with Andre. He said, you know, I know about it, but it's not true. So I put in what he said. He begged me to take that out because he said that Liz, his wife, didn't know all about it, but didn't know about it. But of course, that could not have been true. It might have been true about the particular incident, but she knew well and still knows well about all of his various activities. I interviewed a woman on the record who had a 6-year affair with Felix, and they lived at what is now the Plaza Atene, and was then the Hotel Alray. And they lived there together, and there's an incredible story that she tells me there. With regard to the grand jury investigation, you know, for almost 2 years, Felix denied that this had ever happened. Until finally we were at this wonderful lunch at the Four Seasons Hotel, Four Seasons restaurant. Now, you know, I'm sure you all know that the action at lunchtime at the Four Seasons restaurant is in the grill room. The grill room. When you come up the stairs, sort of right in front of you. At night, the action is in the pool room to the left. And don't ask me why, but that's the way it is. And so I get up to the top of the stairs and I say, I'm here to have lunch with Mr. Rowan. And they say, oh, well, no, we don't have Felix is not here today. And I say, well, he must be, because I'm here and I'm supposed to have lunch with him. And it turns out that Felix, who eats every day in the grill room, did not want to be seen with me in the grill room, so we had lunch in the pool room. At that lunch, he begged me to take out both the business of Andre knocking at his door and this business of the grand jury, until, I said, Felix, it's just not going to happen. And finally he said, about, knowing that we were at the end here, said, well, I'm not saying that the grand jury investigation didn't happen. Now, this is the first time he had said anything remotely like this. He said, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that I can't recall whether it happened or not. I took that as confirmation prima facie that it did happen. I had already had it confirmed, but finally Felix was admitting it. So that was sort of the deal with Felix. And of course, I've not heard from Felix since the book came out. Felix would literally call me every week or two throughout the 2 years that I was working on it. Since the book's come out, I've heard nothing. Michel was much easier, so it's a much shorter story. He was like an open book. Everything on the record, didn't want to see anything. He's like his caricature, his smoking cigars, very Gallic, never unbuttoning his jacket during the interviews. I interviewed him at his incredible apartment on Fifth Avenue with literally one of the 100 best art collections in the world. I interviewed him at his house in Paris, which is like going to the Frick. I mean, it's literally like the Frick Museum, only he owns the whole thing, and his daughters live on various floors of the house, and it's off the Saint-Germain-des-Prés. It's a very beautiful house. I could have gone to his house in the south of France, but I figured enough was enough with that. So the only thing he really cared about is how I wrote about his longtime mistress. Michel has quite acknowledged, quite open about it, a 25, maybe even 30-year now mistress who lives near him on Long Island in Locust Valley. And all he cared about was how I described her. And, he asked me, he knew I was going to write about her, and he asked me not to call her. Now, normally I would have just ignored that. But in this case, since he'd been so open about his relationship with this woman, and his wife knew, and he wasn't trying to hide anything, he wasn't being that duplicitous, I guess, I'll go that far, I figured I will leave her alone. And so I just wrote some stuff that other people had written in Vanity Fair and elsewhere about her. So but I did have to go up in December of '06, the book came out in April of '07, to go see him in his huge office at Lazard, which he has since given up because he no longer is there. And he read literally the manuscript, the galleys of how I described this relationship. And he looked up over his pince-nez and he said, this is a very bitter pill. So that was Michel. And I've never heard from Michel either. Not a word. Not a word. And Michel was always extremely open with me, extremely. I mean, you could ask him anything. After Edouard, his son-in-law, got murdered in Geneva by his girlfriend in a latex suit, which is extraordinary to contemplate, I asked Michel about it literally a week later, and he, said, yeah, my father always said, in love and in money, anything is possible. So I'm not surprised a fellow like that met an end like that. This was his son-in-law. I'm not surprised a fellow like that would meet such an end. Steve Ratner, a little more nuanced and complex, because Steve was himself a first-rate reporter. As I mentioned, best friends with Arthur Sulzberger. I don't think there's been a bad article written about him in the New York Times. I don't think there ever will be a bad article written about him in the New York Times. And I think it is probably best for the New York Times not to be faced with the issue of Steve Ratner being Secretary of the Treasury, because that would have been a conflict that I don't know how they would have dealt with. Steve's only rule with me was, you know, when I got ready to quote him, I would share with him the quotes and he could fiddle with the language. So we did that, and that was no big deal. And some of the stuff he told me was off the record, some of it was on the record. Then though, the book was being produced, and it started to appear, blurbs about it started appearing on various websites, the Random House website, the Amazon.com wrote about it, and I hadn't written what was written by the publisher about it, but it described him as an ambitious and aggressive former New York Times reporter. So in the summer of '06, I was on Nantucket vacationing, and Steve has a house on Martha's Vineyard, and he called me up. He called me, left a message at in New York, and I got it and called him back in New York. I mean, it was the silliest thing. I knew he was in Martha's Vineyard. He knew I was in Nantucket, but we were calling and doing this all through New York. Eventually, at 8 o'clock one beautiful summer night, he calls me, finally reaches me, and I'm not going to imitate Steve. But the only thing he said, somebody had just sent him the link to these websites that described him as an ambitious and aggressive former New York Times reporter. And he said to me, "Look, I just can't have that. I can't have that on these websites." I said, "Steve, well, you know, first of all, I didn't write it, so I'm not sure there's anything I can do about it." I said, "But what's wrong with it?" He said, "I mean, aren't you an ambitious and aggressive former New York Times reporter?" "Yes," he said, I am, whatever, that's not the issue. It's just that I'm concerned that the people who aren't going to take the time to read your very careful, the book hadn't come out, your very carefully researched and written book, who aren't going to take the time to do that, might get the wrong impression of me. So I said, well, I'll see what I can do. And the publisher decided to, because this book was embargoed so that nobody could get it, and I think they didn't want any legal waves that, you know, didn't have to have. So they took that off the Random House website, only to literally have it appear 3 days later on the Amazon website. And Steve calls me up again and makes another case for this again. And, you know, without any, you know, he just has no, you know, self-awareness about it. Just, you know, think it's no big deal to try to do this. And I said, I don't know that I can do anything about that. And so I don't know whatever happened to that. But then the book came out, and I didn't hear much from Steve until I won, the book won the FT award last October. And one of the books I beat out, and I think the one that I supposedly did beat out, was Alan Greenspan's book. So this apparently was very impressive to Steve. And he emailed me one Saturday night at 9 o'clock saying, you know, congratulations on winning this. And I'm thinking, you know, this is what, you know, the future Secretary of the Treasury is doing on a Saturday night at 9 o'clock, emailing me about this book award. So that was nice. Bruce was the only one who did not talk to me. Bruce is, as I describe him, the lusty contrarian. So what everyone else was doing, he didn't want to do. That's just by his nature. When everybody's zigging, he zags. When everybody's firing on Wall Street, he's hiring. You know, when everybody is all caught up in the credit crunch, he says, we don't have anything to do with all that, except yesterday he revealed that they did. So, you know, he's another master of contradictions. And one of the things he's immensely conflicted about is his relationship with the press. As I mentioned, he would not talk to me, but he did allow all of his deputies, many of whom I knew anyway and would have talked to anyway, to talk to me. So he authorized them to talk to me. So I got his side of the story in spades, you know, repetition. They were all singing from the same hymn book when it came to Bruce. And so I dutifully reported that. It was lovely. And but you have to know about Bruce that, you know, obviously he owns New York Magazine. He owns a bunch of other publications. He was a journalist at the University of Michigan, the executive editor of his college newspaper. He was a summer intern at Forbes. He's on the board of advisors of Columbia Journalism School, where I'm a graduate. And he has given something like $40 million to Harvard Law School to, promote constitutional issues, of which I think the last time I checked the First Amendment was one of them. And he has been nothing but trying to thwart this book at every turn, and I'll just leave you with this. The first time the Wall Street Journal wrote about this book, or maybe it was the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, just sort of a preview article of the book, which was, you know, wonderful of them. And then Lazard was quoted, and the quote was, this book is, quote unquote, this is Bruce talking, substantially inaccurate, written by a junior banker, and of absolutely no relevance to Lazard today. And this is one of our stewards of journalism, who has done much more than that. I won't bore you with the gory details of other things, but it's not a pretty picture of some of the other things he's done to try to thwart this. So that's a little bit sort of behind the scenes of what happened with writing this book. I will say that, not to be fatalistic, but people who've written about Lazard often meet tragic ends. And the Carey Reich, who I mentioned, who wrote The Financier, he died very young. Right soon after that, he wrote one other book about the Rockefellers. He was in the middle of a two-volume book, and he died of cancer, and right after his wife died of cancer. There was a woman who wrote about Michelle in W Magazine in 1986. It was one of the great all-time articles about Lazard, and this is one of those rare instances where, because he was Michelle, he could get press, and Felix couldn't do anything about it. And it was this incredible spread of him and his family down at his house on the Mediterranean coast of France. And Michel is in his bathing suit, of all things, is not a particularly interesting thing to contemplate. And it was in the days before cell phones. So Michel has got this phone that goes, cord that must be 100 feet. And it's in the picture that goes from this house down the stone steps all the way down to the coast where he is lounging with his wife and daughters and taking phone calls. The woman who wrote that story was the Paris correspondent for W Magazine. She subsequently moved back to New York and moved up to Cape Cod and was murdered it turns out by her, you know, the cable guy or something. And there was a book written, a very excellent book written about that whole thing. There's other instances, I won't bore you with it, but I think if I were living in Moscow, I may not be alive now. And I hope I'm safe here in New York, but you never know. So I'm happy to answer questions about Lazard or Bear Stearns or the markets in general. Banker compensation, that's really boring, so we don't want to talk about that. So, thank you. Now, this isn't a time to be shy. Please.
Given the current mess, certainly on Wall Street, with banks and securities and whatever, do you see massive regulatory changes coming out of all this?
I do. I think this is.
Sorry.
Given the current mess, which is yet another of the never-ending series of messes that we've found ourselves in the last decade, do I see regulatory change coming out of this? One of the things I said in the article and wrote in the FT last Friday was that this is a unique moment in the generation when I think that finally the regulators have the upper hand with Wall Street, and that this is a moment where there could be real regulatory reform. The question is, will they do it right? And that you never know that. You know, I really think that the whole compensation system should be reformed, and it's up to the boards of directors of Wall Street firms to initiate that with a little nudge from the regulators. And I had one a board of director member of a Wall Street firm tell me that this made a lot of sense to him. So there's possibility, but you know, I think that to expect too much to come is sort of folly because of the amount of money that comes from Wall Street to the Senate, the Congress, the people who make these decisions is so vast and so extensive that I'm not too sanguine about it actually happening.
How did you convince Jimmy Kane to talk to you, and have you talked to him yet?
It's a professional secret. The answer is I have not talked to Jimmy yet. I think I'm getting closer, but I could be an illusion. You know, he is extremely, well, he's quote-unquote retired, but he also is the target of something like 20 or 25 lawsuits. So probably his lawyers would advise him not to. On the other hand, you know, sometimes lawyers get overruled in these situations, so it's unclear. I've gotten already, and I've only been at this about a month, I've gotten some serious high-level interviews of people already, and I think I actually have a fairly strong grasp on a lot of what went on there. Please.
I'm just wondering, apart from the four that you described in some detail and not particularly in glowing terms, did you find anyone who did have adequate qualities? And if so, what were those qualities that allowed them to excel in Lazard Frères despite being led by apparently rather less noteworthy?
Well, I think, you know, to be fair, I mean, it's sort of fun to talk about their foibles, so that's sort of why I do it. But, I mean, my whole desire in writing this book was to bring them down off their pedestals that they had put themselves on and the press had contributed to, you know, and they had all the trappings, you know, the Fifth Avenue apartments, the mansions in the Hamptons, you know, the jets, the whole thing, the cigars, the affairs, all the trappings. And the first thing I did was refer to them all by their first names. And I did that intentionally. And then, but I mean, if you really step back, there was an incredible, it was like a Florentine guild. I mean, it really was. It was an incredible collection of very, very smart people, quasi-Renaissance men. There was nothing quite like it. And I worked at other firms. There was nothing quite like it. And really, Felix and Andre, you know, created the M&A business, created the business of getting CEOs of corporations to pay them millions of dollars for their advice. I mean, it's an extraordinary accomplishment that I don't think people, you know, fathom. And it is a huge business on Wall Street today, even if it is down in the dumps. I mean, you know, trillion-dollar business, and they created it, and that is a major accomplishment. You know, there were an unbelievable collection of people there, and you know, literally, I feel like, you know, we all could say this about places we've been, but you know, some of my best friends worked there, and it's true. Part of it, you know, the people who were sort of at my level, we feel sort of that we were in boot camp together, because it was, you know, there was really the haves and the have-nots. And among the haves, you know, it just made people who got there and were very talented, very smart, but to succeed there you had to, and this is true of all Wall Street, you just have to be, in many respects, to succeed, I'm sorry to say, and don't take this the wrong way, I think you really have to become a bit of a monster to succeed on Wall Street at the highest levels. And I think, you know, you can come in being a very nice person, but the cues that you get and the role models that you get along the way tell you to abandon, you know, what your parents taught you and, you know, go over here to the dark side and become something that, you know, you really wouldn't recognize. And I think that's sort of what happens. And not only at Lazard, but it was especially so at Lazard because it was all about the intellect. It was everything. There was no capital involved. It was all about the mind and, you know, what have you done for me lately? What deals? You know, every year you started with a blank sheet of paper. Go ahead.
I don't know if you followed enough along in your Bear Stearns study, but do you think there was a correlation between the lack of participation in the long-term capital and everybody abandoning him at the end right now?
Yes, this is a prominent theory. This is a prominent theory. I think Bear Stearns never had any friends on Wall Street. And I think that the long-term capital incident was just an example of that. You know, I can tell you that already I can see similarities between Lazard and Bear Stearns, even though they couldn't be more different culturally and what they did on Wall Street. But what I find is that Bear Stearns was run by 4 guys who had worked there and nowhere else for basically the last 50 years, say. And they were completely wedded to the status quo. And they were, you know, Jimmy Cain was reinforced in the status quo because his stock was, you know, the stock was at 172 and change as recently as January of '07, and you know, everybody else was doing all these crazy things, and we just stuck to our knitting, and our stock was better. And by the way, I'm the only CEO on Wall Street worth $1 billion. There's not another one on Wall Street in his own stock. Bruce is worth more than $1 billion, but it was from various other things. And I found that those guys were very wedded to the status quo, just like Michel and Felix. I mean, you could not have 2 guys more wedded to the status quo than Michel Davidet and Felix Rohatyn. I mean, and why not? I mean, every year, you know, 25 million, 30 million, 40 million, whatever they wanted, they just took out of that place. And they were sitting at the top of the pyramid, so it was great.
You wrote a piece in April in a UK paper about the slings and arrows.
Yes.
And I'm interested to know, you know, from the greater historical context, you look at it from survived for 160 years, and people come and go. But have you noticed, you know, from the bank of 1848 versus the bank today? I mean, what have some singular themes been to help, you know, attribute to that success? And also, since 2005 especially, what's your take on the transition from a partnership to a publicly traded company?
Well, I think the things that tie it back to 1848 are pretty much sticking to the knitting of a small group of people giving. I mean, obviously in 1848 they weren't giving advice. There was no such thing as giving advice. They were, you know, gold bullion traders. Actually, they were trading in French clothing, and then they moved to San Francisco and eventually traded in gold. I mean, so. And, you know, they really weren't what they are now until Andre Mayer made it that way after World War II. And the Nazis closed down the Paris office. He moved to New York, barely escaped, got here, and basically divined this whole idea of offering advice and being important to important people. But, you know, the DNA is real, this sort of French mystique, this, I mean, Lazard survived any number of catastrophes over the year. They survived the earthquake of 1906, they survived the fall of the French franc in 1924, they survived the rogue trader in the early 30s, they survived the Nazis in the 40s, they survived you know, insider trading in the 80s and the municipal bond scandal in the 90s. I mean, as Michel told me, Wall Street is a very dangerous place, and that is just a very true ism. I mean, we saw it in spades a month ago. It is just incredibly true, and for Lazard to survive this long is a testament. But it's you know, what I was saying in that piece is, you know, and I think it was borne out yesterday. In fact, you know, they shouldn't assume that they survived this long because they're smart. They survive smarter than everybody else. They survived this long because they've been lucky, and you know, they, you know, in the good years, you know, everybody was making tons of money and they were making nothing, and now that everything, you know, everything that was made in the last few years looks like it's losses and wiped out. Now they look a little smarter, although until yesterday they didn't look so smart yesterday. So it's
And what do you think the public?
Oh, the public, since it, yeah, now this is a great irony, of course. I love ironies. And the irony here is that Lazard, as a public company under Bruce Wasserstein, is actually more closed and more secretive and less open to everything than it was under Michel as a private partnership.
How does that feel? I mean, why do you say that that's the case?
Because I think, and you know, you were there, that here's my thesis. At least under Michel, you could always go in and talk to Michel. He always had all the time in the world. The partnership agreement was published every year. Everybody knew what everybody else made. You know, maybe not down to the nth degree, a little side deal here, a little side deal there. But, you know, Augustinelli knew what Rinaldini made, knew what Loomis made. It was all there in partnership points. Now what do you know? Now you know what the top 5 guys make, period, because that's the SEC requirements. Everybody's on a contract. You know, every deal is separate. There's no one for all. It's all, everybody's a contractual player. And of course, Bruce is the ultimate enigma, you know, that, you know, doesn't really interact with his partners, not nearly as gregarious in any way as Michel. Now, maybe much smarter, maybe a much better banker, and certainly a much better businessman. But, you know, there was something very, you know, special and collegial about Lazard during the time we were there. And now I think it's just like everywhere else. Now, I could be wrong because I don't work there, but I don't know. That's my feeling.
Back to Bear Stearns. Did Ralph Chaffee do anything improper?
Well, that is a question that is being hotly debated over in Brooklyn right now, in the Eastern District of New York. The people are being subpoenaed, documents are being caravanned over there, people are being interviewed, lots of them. My bet is that, I don't know, it looks like to me he will be indicted, but I could be wrong. I don't want to, you know, I don't really know. Yeah, Ralph Chaffee it's an amazing, and this is really the heart of the Bear Stearns story, I think. A firm that for, you know, was founded on May 1st, 85 years ago, literally 85 years ago, and didn't make it to its 85th birthday. For the first 3.5 years, the firm was known for extraordinary controls of cost and risk, and all of a sudden, you know, they decide that they want to build up their asset management business, which was a very small business and not core to them in any way. And so they decided to create all these siloed hedge funds, you know, with hedge fund managers who had worked at various other parts of the firm. They didn't want to go out and pay the money to bring in a star. They brought in people who had worked in other parts of the firm and decided, okay, maybe you can do something. Ralph Chaffee was a guy who was Warren Spector's right-hand guy. Warren Spector ran about 80% of the firm before he was fired in August. And he was, I think, an institutional salesman or something like that. But it was a real superstar at the firm for a long time and made a ton of money and lived a very big lifestyle and, you know, I think almost bought a $1 million Ferrari, that kind of guy. And he set up these hedge funds, even though he had never managed a hedge fund, never managed any assets before. And long story short, the funds went completely bankrupt. And the question is what did they know and when did they know it? And that's what the U.S. attorneys are investigating now very, very, very deeply and seriously. And I think, based on what I've seen from complaints that have been filed by some of the creditors, and Massachusetts has a complaint out there, State Attorney General, doesn't look good to me. But I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for sure.
We can take one more question, one last question. Any predictions as to whether any other Wall Street firms are going to go belly up?
I mean, I've given this a lot of thought, actually. I think that, you know, it could have been, I do agree with what they said. That, you know, I agree with sort of the Bernanke, Steele, Paulson, Tim Geithner line, that they had to do this because the internecine relationships between all these firms were intense in every way, and they were also interconnected. Had they not done something like this, I think there could have been a lot more trouble. There's no question that Lehman was absolutely on the brink, but you know, they got lucky. They had a more diverse business. The Fed opened the borrowing window, and that changed everything. You know, underwriting this huge loan. You know, it was a real, that's why I'm writing about it. It was a historic event. It was a real game changer, as they say. So I think we're okay at the moment, but you know, Wall Street is very good at always fighting the last battle, the previous battle. I mean, this credit, you know, derivatives and credit default swaps market, which, you know, Bob Rubin said he didn't even know what that all meant, you know, a few months ago. That's what, something like $61 trillion of contracts between financial services firms that nobody is unregulated, and you know, could be a huge, huge mess if something happened there.
On that note, thank you very much, and there'll be a reception next door.
Thank you.